We're speaking with Stephen F. Cohen, Professor Emeritus in Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. He is author of a number of books, including Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War. Professor Cohen is a contributing editor at The Nation magazine. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Cohen.
My pleasure.
As we begin our discussion about the Ukraine, it was interesting to note that as thousands of protesters continued their couple-of-week vigil in Ukraine's capital of Kiev over their objection to Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych's refusal to sign a trade agreement with the European Union, U.S. Senator John McCain traveled to Kiev to address the crowd of protesters there, where he expressed support for their cause and said, "The destiny you seek lies in Europe." McCain, while in Ukraine, also criticized Russia for interfering in Ukraine's trade policy and threatened economic sanctions against President Yanukovych's government if police should suppress dissent there. It was interesting, the irony, of course, that John McCain there, addressing protesters in Kiev, accusing Russia of interfering in Ukraine's trade deal.
Gone beyond irony with McCain. I think it's a kind of obscenity and a disgrace for American elected officials to behave as they do. It's not only McCain. He's been accompanied by the Democratic senator from Connecticut. I think his name is Christopher Murphy, but I've forgotten his last name. So and the Democratic senator from Connecticut said he was with McCain to show bipartisan support for this. In fact, almost all of America's unwise policy toward Russia since the Soviet Union ended in 1991 has been bipartisan. It began with Clinton, it went to Bush. The Congress has pretty much backed anything the president, whether Republican or Democratic, did. But in the case of McCain, there's something just wacky about this. This is not the first time he's done that. He liked to go to the former Soviet Republic of Georgia before 2008. And the things he said there, not only McCain but others, the late Richard Holman and others, Holbrooke, certainly encouraged President Saakashvili of Georgia to attack the Russian enclave in Georgia, to kill a number of Russian citizens and some UN observers, and lead Russia to come into Georgia in 2008. And if we know fully the story of what happened, we the United States, because that was a kind of proxy war, as close to war with Russia as we had since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet these people take no responsibility for their action. Of course, it's easy to say it's a double standard. Putin sits in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and threatens Russia over its alleged meddling in Kiev. But there are no Russian officials addressing the protesters in the crowds in Kiev, but there is McCain, there's Senator Murphy, there's Victoria Nuland from the State Department. There's a host of Americans. These Americans seem to think they have the right to go to any country, and they rightly say it's a sovereign decision for Ukraine. But if it's a sovereign decision, what are American officials doing there? I mean, imagine that there was a conflict between Canada and the United States, and Canada decided to join a Russian Economic Trade Association agreement because of its proximity to Russia in the north, or the Arctic, or oil, whatever. Can you imagine the American reaction with Russians standing across the American border in Canada telling the Canadians what they should do, that the government should sign this agreement? It's just unwise. It's become reckless. It's dangerous. And these people bear no responsibility at home. The media doesn't fault them. Their own parties don't fault them. But it's very bad American behavior.
Professor Cohen, the U.S. media generally parrots the State Department line and people like Senator John McCain as saying that Russia is bullying Ukraine into dropping its original predilection to go ahead with a European trade agreement. Now Russia's offering some money here. On the other side, and I know you'll talk about this, is that the European Union deal offers austerity of the kind that has plagued many of the Western European nations where austerity has been in place with very high unemployment figures. But maybe you could talk about the conflict here in terms of decisions the Ukraine has to make.
Well, you said that there was a predilection on the part of the Ukrainian government to sign the Economic Association Agreement with the UN. Certainly, that's what Ukrainian President Yanukovych has been saying for about a year, but I'm not sure it was the truth. It's perfectly possible he was using that as leverage with the Russians to get a better economic deal with the Russians. Let's back up just a minute, because you mentioned the American media, and look at the narrative that virtually every American is stuck with if that American watches mainstream television or reads the mainstream newspapers. There are four pieces to the narrative that we find in the American media about what's going on in Ukraine. First of all, that the signing with the EU would bring democracy to Ukraine, and therefore the protesters in the street are pro-democratic. Secondly, it would bring economic prosperity to Ukraine, because Ukraine would have access to Europe's markets, all the perks of the economic union. Thirdly, it's a civilization choice. That's a phrase often used, that they would escape the Slavic Russian civilization and become, like us, part of Western civilization. And fourth, this is being prevented by Russia's bullying and meddling. Fact is, all four of these bits of the narrative are false or misleading. The protesters in the street are now calling for the overthrow of Yanukovych's government, and they're being supported by the American representatives in Kiev. That was a democratically elected government, both the parliament and the president. And everybody agreed that that election was pretty fair, pretty clean election. It is not democratic to overthrow a democratically elected government. It's the opposite of that. There's an election scheduled for 2/15. So the answer to these people is, if you feel that strongly, that you've been betrayed by the government you elected and the parliament you elected in the year 2015, get your electoral act in order and go out and defeat them. But to tell them to try to overthrow, to turn this into a regime change, which has become the policy of the European Union and apparently the State Department, that is anti-democratic. So we are the promoters of anti-democratic action in Ukraine, not the Russians at this stage. As for prosperity, Ukraine is an absolute economic basket case. It needs $18 billion in the next 16 months to avoid going belly up, defaulting on its sovereign debt. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will give it part of that, but only, as you just said, on the conditions that enact a kind of austerity program, which means cutting social services, means letting people go. It means ending subsidies to people who don't make a sufficient wage, and most Ukrainians make about $150 a month. It would have the kind of impact, but worse, because Ukraine is poorer than as it's had in Spain and Greece. Moreover, do we really believe, does anybody believe, that Ukrainian goods produced in Ukraine, are going to be successful in Italy and France and Spain and Germany? This is utter nonsense. And finally, there's a very strong anti-migration movement spreading across Europe. It's highly unlikely that unemployed Ukrainian workers will be welcomed into the European Union. So that's a kind of myth. The only country that can help in a practical way, and maybe it would be bad because maybe there would be political conditions, but if we're talking about prosperity, we're talking about economic well-being, it's only Russia. Russia is about between 25 and 30% of the market for all Ukrainian goods, and Ukraine gets most of its energy from Russia. Russia's in a position to give Ukraine very favorable access to all of its markets and to give it discounted energy. As for civilization, I mean, people can no more jump out of their civilization than you and I can jump out of our skin. Ukrainians, Eastern and Southern Ukrainians at least, because it's really two countries, are Slavs. Russia was born in Kiev. They've been one civilization forever and ever and ever. If you want to blame anybody for this, you blame God. But you don't tell people to jump out of a 1,000-year civilization just like that. And as for Russia's bullying, what Russia's done is exactly what, what the EU has done. It's playing economic hardball. Ukraine is for sale. That's what's going on. The government of Yanukovych has been saying, who makes me the best offer? And Russia's making an offer, and the EU's making an offer. And when we last turned the page, Russia's offer was better. Now today, Tuesday, December 17th, Yanukovych is going to Moscow to talk to Putin. We assume that Putin's going to make a new financial offer. But that's not bullying. That's bidding, and it's exactly what the European Union is doing. So this narrative account is just misleading in the extreme.
Professor Cohen, one of the features of the proposed pact or association agreement between Ukraine and Europe also has a provision for military alliance of some kind down the road. You've recently been visiting in Russia. You've studied Russia for years and years. What is the view from Moscow in terms of the expansion eastward of NATO over these decades since the end of the Cold War? And what would an eventual decision by the Ukraine to join NATO mean to Moscow?
Well, from the point of view of the Russian political class, the elite that runs the country, they see this so-called economic association that the EU is offering to Ukraine not as economic, but as geopolitical. That is, as you say, part and parcel of the West march toward Russia, toward the former Soviet Union, with Ukraine, the largest former republic of the Soviet Union, except for Russia itself, as the ultimate prize. 45 million people, a large land mass, natural resources, and the center of Russia's naval fleet. So they see this in political military terms as NATO expansion, which now has three components. NATO itself has moved to Russia's border. That is now the Obama administration, is proposing to build missile defense installations on Russia's borders. That's definitely military. And they see this so-called economic association as including certain protocols that require what are summarized as closer economic cooperation with the European Union, which is virtually synonymous with NATO. Now, so far as I know, the whole protocol, which runs into hundreds, if not thousands of pages, has not been published. But parts of it that have been read and summarized indicate, as you say, that it does have this language, that the economic agreement would include a commitment by Ukraine for closer military cooperation with Europe. Now, what does that mean for the Russian naval base in Ukraine? What does it mean for Ukraine's weapons? Would they have to discard those weapons, which are largely Russian-Ukrainian built? Because one requirement of NATO is that there be conformity of NATO's weapons among its member countries. So those contracts would go to Western arms makers. But in a general sense, there's absolutely no doubt that the people who run Russia, and who are not fools, whether they're good or bad people is another question, they're not fools, see this whole thing as part of the military march by the West toward Russia. And I think reasonably, we can see their point.
We're speaking with Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus in Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. And Professor Cohen, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about Russia's naval base on the Black Sea at Sevastopol. That, as far as I've read in the past, is Russia's only warm water port, as they put it.
The fleet itself is antiquated. Russia's modernizing its navy, and in a kind of ultimate way, down the road, they won't need that port. But it has been for hundreds of years the traditional base of Russia's navy. It has historical, cultural, political, sentimental residence in Russia. Now, after the end of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became a sovereign nation, there was a lot of back and forth about what would happen to that fleet. And a few years ago, Russia signed an agreement with Ukraine. And here I'm going to let you down because I don't remember if it was for 25 or 45 years. I should remember, I just don't, but it doesn't matter. It signed a long-term agreement with Ukraine that Russia could continue to base its fleet there. Now, here we got to remember something else. The media keeps saying the Ukrainian people want to go to Europe. There is no the Ukrainian people. Some people think there are 6 Ukraines, but realistically there are at least 2. Eastern and southern Ukraine are Russian ethnically. They speak Russian. They worship in the Russian Orthodox Church. They are at a very high percentage, maybe 50, 60% intermarried with Russians. They have always regarded Russian Ukraine as one. Western Ukraine, which includes Kiev, the capital, has tended to be more Western been Germany or France that's led this European Union march toward Ukraine, it's been Poland and Sweden. And we could discuss why they are so interested in attaching Ukraine to the European Union. I think it has something to do with their fear of Germany. They'd like their own empire in the East to offset Germany's economic power, its strength. But the point here is that there is no one Ukraine. So any analyst who comes on or goes to Ukraine or in Congress says, the Ukrainian people want this, doesn't know what he or she is talking about or is lying. Ukraine is split. And when you, depending on how you ask the question in surveys, you get fairly close to a 50-50 split. That one part of the country would like to go west, the other wants to stay with Russia in the east. What does this mean? I think if we think analytically, and if push keeps coming to shove, provoked by people like John McCain and by the policy of Brussels in the European Union and the American Congress, it's not unimaginable that in the not-too-distant future there will be a division, a split, a partition, let's hope not a civil war, but there will be two Ukraines. One, a province of Russia, and one, I don't know how you formulate this, but a province of Poland or of the European Union. That outcome would be a tragedy for Ukraine as a nation. But some people think Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation, that it's at least two nations. And that's the real kind of empirical reality of this political conflict we're being told about every day in the paper, but which is largely ignored. There's not one Ukraine, there's two. And in Kiev, they're on opposing sides of the barricades. And that, too, is a product of history. Nobody's to fault for that. But if politicians don't take that into account, they're playing with fire.
Professor Cohen, I wondered if you would speak a little bit about the economic interests and where they lie in a divided Ukraine. As you mentioned just a moment ago, these divisions, they lie in the ethnicity and the religion and language. But economically, eastern Ukraine relies on markets in Russia, whereas the West relies more on ties with Europe. What would happen to eastern Ukraine and the heavy industry there if this European Association Agreement were signed?
It would die. Slowly, but it would die. Because it depends heavily on supplies from Russia. And if Russia abides by its own laws, remember now, Putin is trying to create something called the Eurasian Customs Union. He calls it a European Union of the East. And he says eventually it will cooperate with the European Union. But he wants as many former Soviet republics as possible to join. And they would have economic privileges. There would be no customs on their goods. It would just be one big market. So they would be cheaper than non-union goods. That people who lived in the countries that belonged to the Union could work freely without extra taxation or any impediments, could find employment, and there are a lot of unemployed people, and Russia has a pretty good employment market, could work there, and that in addition, they would enjoy subsidized Russian energy. As you know, Russia is periodically number one or number two in producing oil and natural gas in the world. So Russia has a lot of this. Those are very real advantages, and that's quite as part from the low-interest loans that Russian banks can make to these countries that are not terribly solvent. Those are real economic advantages. Now, in the West, that's presented as Russian bullying, as Russia imperialism, as Putin's attempt to recreate the Soviet Union, but it's exactly what the United States, Western democracies, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank do. They make loans on certain political and economic conditions. It's a form of business. It's been going on in international relations for decades. So Russia's now playing the Western game, but we have this double standard of calling it imperialism. Well, if it's imperialism, so too is exactly what we're trying to do. I personally think, but I'm not an economist, that in the short run, and you remember King said we all die in the long run, but in the short run, let's say the next 20 to 25 years, Ukraine is much better off in economic alliance with Russia because it's not going to have austerity imposed on it. It is going to get these benefits that it desperately needs to stay afloat and to help its people. Now, there is an ideal solution. which has been brooded, and Putin actually proposed it. That was that a special arrangement would be made for Ukraine, that it would be a country that could have a flexible economic relationship both with the European Union and with Putin's new Eurasian customs union. Now, everybody knows that a wise statesman, if he or she has been courted by two sides, gets the best deal he or she can from both sides. But with the exception of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, every leader of the European Union has said no. If you want to be in economic association with the European Union, you cannot be in economic association with Putin, which I think is to the disadvantage of Ukraine. Now, again, Yanukovych is in Moscow. Maybe as we speak, it's 9 hours later there. It's now 9:30 in the morning. Maybe Putin is saying to him, look, Victor, I'm going to help you out, and I'm going to help you politically. I'm going to give you some economic carrots to keep you afloat, and I'm not going to demand that you join my economic union. See what you can bargain out of the European Union. If you can get something from them and from us, okay, because we want political stability in Ukraine. We don't want two Ukraines. And he might say also we don't want any military protocols in any agreement you sign. That might happen, but at the moment the position of the European Union is no, you cannot do this. It's our way or the highway. Putin hasn't taken that position publicly, though I don't know what he's told Yanukovych privately. But we're going to know, maybe as soon as tomorrow or the day after.
Thank you for that, Professor Cohen. I wanted to ask you about this trajectory we've been on since the end of the Cold War, quote unquote, that these tensions between the United States and Russia persist, and it grows hotter and colder sometimes. Putin has certainly been a major player in that. But I wonder who benefits from a continuation of the Cold War on this side of the Atlantic?
Well, if we leave aside people who manufacture weapons, and they exist both in Russia and the United States, and Czechoslovakia and Israel and Germany and lots of other countries, and we leave aside this element in our political elite and the Russian political elite that associate their own importance in the world with the greatest of power. We leave those people aside. Nobody benefits from it at all, and there's no reason for it. I've taken the view for the last 20 years that the Cold War didn't really end, certainly not in Washington. That beginning with the Clinton administration in 1993, Washington has pursued toward post-communist Russia, post-Soviet Russia, what I call a winner-take-all policy, on the analogy that post-Cold War Russia, post-Soviet Union Russia, was like Germany and Japan after World War II, a defeated nation. And just as we dictated to Germany and Japan after World War II, Washington has thought it could dictate to Moscow. It got away with this for almost a decade, in the 1990s, when President Yeltsin, a weak leader, an unwell leader, an insecure leader, went along with Washington, at least in words. But there was bound to be, and anybody who studied Russia, whether American or Russian, knew there was bound to be what Russians call an obratnaya reaction, a backlash. And that backlash is Vladimir Putin. When he came to power in 2000, he began to make it clear, as he put it, there would be no more unilateral concessions to the United States. If the United States wanted something from Moscow, it had to give Moscow something, as would be the case between any two great powers. That's been Putin's foreign policy. I want to cooperate with you, but cooperation is a two-way street. If I help you in Afghanistan, as I have done for many years, saved American lives, I expect some considerations. I've yet to get them from you. That's the Cold War American policy. I don't think Russia's pursuing a Cold War. I don't think it has any interest in it. Russia is oriented internally. It needs to modernize Russia. It needs all its money to rebuild Russia's infrastructure. It doesn't need this. I don't think there's any interest among ordinary Americans. None of the polls show it, of desire for a new Cold War. There's certainly none among Russians. This is a disease of our political elite, our bipartisan political elite. Both of them are sick with the Cold War fever. They've never got over it. The greatest personalized expression of this is Senator John McCain. But he's not alone. Remember the Congress that passed the so-called Magnitsky Bill, which said that we are going to decide who commits human rights violations in Russia, and we're going to punish those people by seizing their assets or denying them visas. This is kind of kangaroo court, kind of McCarthyism. There's no due process here. This is the kind of thing that members of the political elite do, that people who go to work every day don't do. They don't care about this. They have other values. But the American electorate lets these people get away with it. They're elected and they're reelected. And by the way, there's the same analogy in Russia. It exists on both sides. And they are the enemy of the peace, of the post-Cold War peace, which we don't have yet.
Professor Cohen, what's your assessment of President Obama now in his second term? What has his attitude been in this on and off, again, tensions with Russia?
Well, for me, it's a kind of complicated question because it's a personal question. I'm no longer young. I grew up in the American South, in Kentucky, in a completely segregated society. I was a witness to and a sort of minor participant in the civil rights struggle of the 50s and 60s. So I voted for Obama as an act of historical justice. I thought it was one of the great acts of historical justice in America that a black man was elected president. However, as a political historian and a biographer, I never saw Obama as a leader. I saw him as a great electoral candidate, but not as a leader in the way that we think of some American presidents in our memory as leaders. And in his first term and the beginning of his second term, I felt that his behavior in the White House confirmed, not entirely, but to a certain degree, that analysis, that he was a great candidate but not a great leader, was correct. But something interesting has now just happened, and think of the irony of this. You remember that when he was elected, he was given the Nobel Prize for doing nothing yet. And people said that wasn't appropriate. He hadn't done anything. Mm-hmm. And he didn't do anything. He expanded the war in Afghanistan. He did get us out of Iraq, but it's a complete mess. He intervened indirectly in Libya. He's been a warfare president. The drones are warfare. And he was on the verge, you remember, just a few months ago, of launching a military attack against Syria. And what happened? Who saved him? Vladimir Putin of Russia came forward with a plan that to put Syria's chemical weapons under international control, UN control, and destroy them. And Obama accepted that, and he didn't have to attack Syria. You remember he was in danger of not getting congressional support, even from his own party. That would have been at least a humiliation and maybe the demolition of his presidency. Putin saved him. Then what happened next? Suddenly the opening to Iran and the question of maybe a peaceful solution of its nuclear ambitions. And who in the shadows was working that diplomacy? Again, Putin, because Russian influence in Iran is very great. Not only Putin, because the new Iranian president played a major role. But here we now have a new situation. We have Obama with the chance to end his presidency as a very considerable foreign policy president, to leave a real legacy in the Middle East in particular. But for that, he needs his partner, Putin. And therefore, he has said next to nothing about Ukraine. His Secretary of State, John Kerry, has said about 8 ill-chosen words, but only 8. And other than that, they left it to this woman, Victoria Nuland, a lower State Department official, to sit in Ukraine and make proclamations. But generally, Obama's been silent, unlike, to contrast it, all the words he expended unwisely on Egypt at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. So at the moment, I think Obama understands that his foreign policy legacy, if he's to have one when he leaves office, requires a partnership with Putin. And he's not eager to get in to spoil that over Ukraine, and I think rightly so.
John McCain is certainly not cooperative with that vision, right?
But look, McCain is an interesting figure. I mean, sometimes he does the right thing, almost by accident, because he liked this idea that he was a maverick. And certainly he had a heroic military career as a prisoner in North Vietnam. But his only ideology in foreign policy seems to be hatred for Russia. It's obsessed him for years. When Putin published an op-ed piece in the New York Times a few months ago about Syria, and by the way, many Russian leaders have published op-ed pieces in the New York Times, wasn't anything new. He led this sort of ballistic charge that it was an obscenity, and he demanded that he be allowed to publish an op-ed article in Russia He thought Pravda was still the Communist Party newspaper. It wasn't, but they published it, and Russians treated it as one big joke. A friend of mine sent me an email the other night, a very astute guy, and he said the fact that McCain is in Kiev, on the streets, giving press conferences, and being broadcast every day on television is the greatest propaganda coup Russia could have been given during this crisis, because Russians view McCain as somewhere between a clown and an evil man. But he has no credibility in Russia whatsoever, though he seems to think, as he puts it, that he speaks for the Russian people. But he no more speaks for the Russian people than he does for the Ukrainian people. You remember, this is the man who said in Georgia on the eve of war, "We are all Georgians." I mean, what kind of reckless talk is that by a senior American senator?
Well, I do remember that during the heated election campaign there, that it looked like campaign operatives for McCain were very well disposed to create a conflict between Russia and Georgia in order to somehow assist McCain to become president.
They were his personal political foreign policy operatives, and they were operating in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. But let's be fair, because that's the tragedy of American politics. On the question of Russia, Senator Charles Schumer of New York, a so-called liberal Democrat, is absolutely no better than McCain. What comes out of his mouth is unwise in the extreme. And by the way, he feels free at critical moments when Obama is working on a delicate agreement with Putin to undercut Obama, his own president, by making some outlandish public statement about Putin being a criminal or something. It's bipartisan disease. I have no idea how to cure it. And since there's probably 5 people with access to the media in America who think as I think, the numbers aren't with us.
Well, unfortunately, that's the case. Professor Stephen Cohen, thank you so much for sharing your analysis of what's going on in Ukraine and, by extension, the larger geopolitical map. I appreciate you spending time with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, and forgive my cold-ridden voice.
Nope, sounded fine. Thanks, Professor
Take
Cohen.
care.
Bye-bye.